What if the most important question humanity has ever asked is also the one we've been approaching the wrong way this entire time? Let me start with something personal, because the kind of conversation we're about to have demands honesty, real honesty, not the polished version people expect. I get asked about God constantly, at conferences, in interviews, during panel discussions, even in random airport lounges. Someone recognizes me, and suddenly I'm expected to have the final answer to a question humans have been asking long before we ever wrote anything down. Does God exist? Is there a creator? Does the universe have a purpose? Did something or someone set all of this into motion? And here's the truth about how I actually feel when people ask me these questions. Not how a scientist is supposed to feel, not what people assume I must think, but how I genuinely feel. I think these are incredibly interesting questions, not threats to science, not outdated leftovers from a pre-scientific world we should politely ignore. These questions go straight to the deepest layers of reality, origin, meaning, intention. They ask whether the universe is just a system of physical processes or something more. And anyone who tells you these questions are simple or already settled isn't paying close enough attention. But here's where things get uncomfortable. It's not the questions I have a problem with. It's the way we try to answer them. Because when it comes to understanding reality, there are right ways and wrong ways to investigate claims. And that difference isn't just academic. It's the difference between building real knowledge and building confident ignorance. When I apply the same standards of evidence and logical rigor to religious claims that I would apply to any other claim about the universe, most of them don't hold up. Not because I'm hostile to religion as a cultural force. Not because I dismiss the human need for meaning, connection, or something larger than ourselves, but because many specific claims about how the physical world works simply don't match what we actually observe. So tonight, I want to walk through those claims carefully. I want to take the strongest arguments seriously, not dismiss them, and show you where they raise real questions and where they fail as scientific explanations. And ultimately, I want to arrive at what I believe is the most intellectually honest position on the relationship between science and religious belief. It won't be comfortable, but it will be honest. Let's start with the foundation because everything else depends on this. Science is not just a collection of facts. It's a method, a very specific way of testing claims about reality that has been refined over centuries. Why? Because we've learned the hard way that our instincts are unreliable. Our minds are full of biases. And the only dependable way to figure out what's actually true is to test our ideas against observations in ways that allow us to be wrong. That's the key. The scientific method demands that claims be testable. If a claim cannot be checked against observation, it can't be confirmed or rejected. It might be true, it might be false, but we have no way of knowing. And if we can't evaluate it, it doesn't add to our understanding of reality. It might still contribute to poetry, identity, or meaning, but not to knowledge. Science also requires reproducibility. If something is real, others should be able to observe it under the same conditions. And it prefers simpler explanations over more complex ones when both explain the data equally well, a principle known as Occam's razor. Now here's the difficult part. Most religious claims about the physical universe don't meet these standards. Not because scientists are biased against religion, not because there's some hidden agenda, but because the claims themselves are structured in ways that make them untestable or unsupported by evidence or unnecessarily complex when simpler explanations already exist. Let me show you exactly what I mean. One of the most sophisticated arguments for the existence of God, especially among scientifically literate believers, is the fine-tuning argument. And I want to treat it seriously because it raises a real and fascinating question, even though it ultimately fails as a scientific argument. Here's the idea. The fundamental constants of physics, the strength of gravity, the electromagnetic force, the cosmological constant, and many others appear to be set at very precise values. Values that allow complex structures to exist. Stars, planets, chemistry, and eventually life. If any of these constants were even slightly different, the universe would be completely lifeless. No atoms beyond hydrogen, no stars, no planets, no biology, nothing. So the argument goes, these constants are finely tuned for life, and that suggests a designer. Now, to be fair, the observation itself is real. The universe does appear to allow complexity and life in a way that is, at the very least, remarkable. Even physicists with no religious motivation have pointed this out. But here's where the argument begins to break down. And it fails not in one way, but in three distinct ways. And the first failure starts with something deceptively simple. When you look at a specific outcome and ask, what are the odds of this exact thing happening? You have to be very careful about what you're actually calculating. Because sometimes, extremely unlikely outcomes are not evidence of design at all. They're just what happens when something had to happen. And this is where the real story begins to get interesting. Because once you understand this first mistake, the fine-tuning argument starts to lose much of its force. Imagine I take a deck of 52 cards, shuffle it thoroughly, and deal them out in a specific order. The probability of that exact sequence appearing is astronomically small, roughly 1 inch 10 to the power of 68. That's a number so large it's almost meaningless in everyday terms. So should you conclude that the shuffle was rigged? Of course not. Because any sequence of 52 cards would have been just as unlikely. The improbability of one specific outcome doesn't mean the process was guided unless you specified that exact outcome in advance. And that's the subtle mistake hidden inside the fine-tuning argument. It asks, what are the odds of these exact constants appearing by chance? And yes, the answer is extremely small. But that's not the right question. The real question is this: if the constants were different, would there still be observers capable of noticing them? This is where what's known as the anthropic principle comes in. It simply states that we can only observe a universe compatible with our own existence. We shouldn't be surprised to find ourselves in a universe that allows life, because if it didn't, we wouldn't be here to ask the question in the first place. It's not that the universe was designed for us. It's that only certain kinds of universes allow observers at all. The second problem with the fine-tuning argument is the analogy it relies on. When you see a watch, you infer a watchmaker. Why? Because you've seen watches being made. You understand the process. You've observed the cause. But when someone says the universe is like a watch, they're making a leap that isn't justified. We have no independent experience of universes being created by designers. We can't observe the process, test it, or verify it. The analogy breaks down exactly where it matters most. And then there's the third and perhaps most important point, the multiverse. This isn't a philosophical escape hatch. It's an idea that emerges naturally from some of our best physical theories. According to modern cosmology, especially models of cosmic inflation, our universe may be just one of an enormous, possibly infinite collection of universes, each with different physical constants. If that's the case, then it's not surprising at all that at least one of those universes has the right conditions for life. And of course, that's the one we find ourselves in. Not because it was chosen, but because it's the only kind we could ever observe. What's crucial here is that the multiverse wasn't invented to avoid the fine-tuning argument. It comes from attempts to solve entirely different problems in physics. The same goes for string theory, which predicts a vast landscape of possible physical constants, something like 10 to the power of 500 different combinations. So now we have a natural explanation for fine-tuning, one that arises from existing physics, not from outside it. The argument for design doesn't defeat these explanations. At best, it highlights a puzzle that science is already working to solve. Now, let's turn to something even more direct, the clash between religious claims and scientific evidence. Creationism, in its various forms, argues that life was directly created by God, rather than evolving through natural processes. Intelligent design is a more refined version. It accepts some evolution but claims that certain biological structures are too complex to have evolved step by step, and therefore must have been designed. The scientific response to these claims isn't based on hostility, it's based on evidence. And that evidence is overwhelming. The fossil record shows a clear pattern of life changing over time. Simpler organisms appear earlier, more complex ones appear later. And we found countless transitional fossils, exactly the kinds of forms that critics once insisted didn't exist. Creatures bridging the gap between fish and land animals, between terrestrial mammals and whales, between dinosaurs and birds. Genetics confirms this picture independently. The relationships between species, written directly into DNA, match what we see in fossils and anatomy with striking precision. Humans and chimpanzees share genetic markers like endogenous retroviruses in the exact same locations in their genomes. These are remnants of ancient viral infections passed down through common ancestry. Our DNA also contains broken copies of genes that function perfectly in other animals, clear evidence of evolutionary modification over time. Even the geographical distribution of species tells the same story. Why are marsupials mostly found in Australia and South America? Because those continents were once connected. The pattern of life follows the history of the Earth itself. And evolution isn't just something we infer from the past. It's happening right now. Bacteria evolve resistance to antibiotics. Viruses adapt to vaccines. Darwin's finches change the size of their beaks within decades, depending on available food. Evolution is not a theory in the casual sense. It's an observable process. And when intelligent design claims that certain systems are irreducibly complex, meaning they couldn't function if any part were missing, the evidence has tested that claim directly. And what it found changed everything. Because when scientists took a closer look at one of the most famous examples, the bacterial flagellum, the argument didn't hold. The flagellum is often described as a microscopic motor, a complex structure that allows bacteria to move. The claim was that it's irreducibly complex, remove any part, and it stops working entirely. Therefore, it couldn't have evolved gradually. It must have been designed. But when researchers studied its components in detail, a very different picture emerged. Many of the parts of the flagellum already existed in simpler biological systems, performing entirely different functions. One of the most striking examples is something called the type 3 secretion system. It uses nearly identical components to inject proteins into other cells. In other words, what looks like a single, indivisible machine is actually built from parts that once had other purposes. Evolution doesn't build things from scratch. It modifies what's already there. So the flagellum isn't irreducibly complex, it's the result of step-by-step adaptations over time. Each stage had a function. Each step was viable. The central claim of intelligent design, in this case, turned out to be factually wrong. This wasn't just debated in academic journals. It was tested in court during the 2005 case of Kitzmiller v. Dover. A federal judge appointed by a conservative administration and personally religious reviewed the evidence in detail. His conclusion was clear. Intelligent design is not science, not because of bias, but because its claims are contradicted by evidence. Now step back and look at the bigger pattern. For most of human history, natural phenomena were explained through supernatural causes. Lightning was the work of gods. Disease was divine punishment. Mental illness was possession. Earthquakes were expressions of divine anger. The movement of planets, the diversity of life, the origin of the universe, all attributed to supernatural forces. But over time, something remarkable happened. Every single one of these explanations was replaced by a natural one. Lightning became electrical discharge. Disease became microbiology. Mental illness became neuroscience. Earthquakes became plate tectonics. Life became evolution. The universe became cosmology. And this pattern moves in one direction. Natural explanations replace supernatural ones. But supernatural explanations have never replaced natural ones, not once. There is no example in the history of science where a natural explanation was discarded in favor of a supernatural one because it worked better. That matters, because it suggests something important not conclusively but strongly. It suggests that what we often interpret as a gap requiring supernatural explanation is usually just a gap in our current knowledge. This is sometimes called the God of the gaps problem, and it's not meant as an insult, it's a precise intellectual criticism. When the argument is, we don't yet understand X, therefore God did it, something has gone wrong, that's not evidence, that's a placeholder. History shows us what usually happens next. We keep investigating, and the natural explanation emerges. Now let's turn to one of the biggest gaps of all, the origin of the universe itself. The Big Bang model describes the universe expanding from an extremely hot, dense state around 13.8 billion years ago. And the evidence supporting it is overwhelming. The expansion of space, the cosmic microwave background radiation, the distribution of galaxies, the abundance of light elements, all point to the same conclusion. But, and this is important, the Big Bang doesn't explain everything. It doesn't tell us what happened before or whether that question even makes sense. At the earliest moments, our current physics breaks down. We don't yet have a complete theory of quantum gravity. We don't know if the universe had an absolute beginning or if it emerged from a prior state. This is a real gap in our understanding. And this is exactly where many religious arguments step in, saying, this is where God enters the uncaused cause, the creator who set everything in motion. Now here's why I don't find that explanation convincing. First, it doesn't actually solve the problem. It replaces one mystery with a bigger one. If the universe needs a cause, then what caused God? And if the answer is that God doesn't need a cause, that God simply exists necessarily, then you can make the same claim about the universe itself. You haven't explained anything, you've just added another layer. Second, physics is actively exploring natural explanations for the origin of the universe. These ideas are still developing, but they are serious, mathematically grounded attempts. Models like Hawking's no-boundary proposal, quantum tunneling from nothing, and loop quantum cosmology all offer possible frameworks. They're not final answers, but they show that natural explanations are possible. And third, invoking God doesn't explain the specific properties of our universe. Why these constants? Why this structure? A creator could have made anything, but why this? Natural explanations at least attempt to answer that. And this leads us to a crucial turning point, because after everything we've examined, the real question isn't just whether specific religious claims hold up. It's what happens when we let go of them. And what replaces them might be far more powerful than most people expect. Because once you begin to let go of explanations that don't hold up under evidence, a deeper question takes their place, and it's one people often avoid. If we don't rely on divine intervention to explain the world, then what actually fills that space? What does a scientifically grounded view of reality say about meaning, purpose, and how we live? Let's begin with something very concrete: prayer. Not prayer as a private, emotional, or meditative experience, but prayer as a claim about reality. Specifically, the idea that asking God to intervene in the physical world can change outcomes, that illnesses can be healed, events altered, results improved through divine response. This isn't vague. It makes clear predictions. If prayer works in that way, then people who are prayed for should, on average, experience better outcomes than those who are not, when all other factors are controlled. And this has been tested. One of the most rigorous studies ever conducted on this question was the STEP project, short for the Study of the Therapeutic Effects of Intercessory Prayer, published in 2006. It examined patients undergoing heart surgery and divided them into groups. Some were prayed for, some were not, and in some cases, patients were even told they were being prayed for. The results were striking. There was no measurable benefit for patients who were prayed for. In fact, in one group, those who knew they were being prayed for complication rates were slightly higher, possibly due to performance anxiety or psychological pressure. Now, one study doesn't settle everything, but it's not the only one. Multiple controlled studies have consistently failed to show any reliable effect of intercessory prayer on physical outcomes. And here's the key point. If a claim makes testable predictions and repeatedly fails those tests, we have to take that seriously. This doesn't mean prayer has no value at all. It may provide comfort, focus, emotional regulation, a sense of connection. But those are psychological effects, not evidence of external intervention in the physical world. And the same standard applies when we talk about miracles. Miracles, by definition, are events that violate the normal laws of nature. But in practice, what we usually find are stories accounts that are difficult to verify, often recorded long after the fact, shaped by cultural expectations and human perception. When examined closely, many of these claims fall into familiar patterns: misinterpretation, coincidence, exaggeration, or lack of reliable documentation. And importantly, we don't see consistent, repeatable evidence of miraculous events under controlled conditions. Now, step back again. If prayer doesn't reliably change physical outcomes and miracles don't withstand careful scrutiny, then the idea of a God who actively intervenes in the day-to-day workings of the world becomes harder to support, not philosophically, but empirically. And this brings us to morality. One of the most common arguments in favor of religion is that it provides the foundation for moral values, that without God, there is no objective basis for right and wrong. But when we actually examine how moral systems develop, a more complex and more interesting picture emerges. Human morality didn't appear suddenly with religious doctrine. It evolved gradually, shaped by social living. Cooperation, empathy, fairness, these traits have clear survival value in social species. We see early forms of them even in other animals. What religion often does is formalize and codify moral intuitions that were already present. And importantly, moral progress has frequently involved challenging religious norms, not simply following them. Movements against slavery, for women's rights, for civil rights, these often require questioning traditional interpretations of religious authority. So morality doesn't disappear without religion. It continues to evolve through reason, empathy, and shared human experience. Now, here's where the conversation becomes even more important, because there's a difference between religion as an institution and spirituality as a personal experience. And confusing the two leads to a lot of misunderstanding, because when people talk about losing religion, what they often fear isn't the loss of doctrine, it's the loss of meaning, connection, and a sense of something larger than themselves. But those experiences don't belong exclusively to religion. Spirituality, in its most basic sense, is about how we experience reality, our sense of wonder, our awareness of existence, our feeling of connection to the world and to others. And those experiences don't disappear when we adopt a scientific worldview. If anything, they can become deeper, because they're no longer filtered through predetermined answers. Think about what science actually reveals. A universe nearly 14 billion years old. Galaxies stretching across unimaginable distances. The fact that every atom in your body was forged in the calm of stars. The emergence of life from chemistry. Consciousness arising from biological processes complex enough to reflect on their own existence. These are not dry facts. They are extraordinary. And they don't require supernatural explanations to be meaningful. They are meaningful because they are real. When you look at the universe this way, meaning isn't something imposed from outside, it's something that emerges from understanding, from recognizing that we are part of a vast, evolving system, that our lives are finite but not insignificant. And that shifts the question. Instead of asking, what is the purpose assigned to me? We begin asking, What kind of meaning can I create within the reality I find myself in? It's a very different kind of responsibility. It doesn't rely on authority. It doesn't depend on tradition. It asks us to think, to question, to engage directly with the world as it is. And this is where I think science has been deeply underestimated. Not just as a tool for dismantling incorrect explanations, but as a source of genuine awe. A framework that invites curiosity instead of closing it off. That replaces certainty with exploration, and in doing so, creates a more honest relationship with reality. Now, let me be clear about something important. Rejecting specific religious claims about the physical world does not mean claiming to have all the answers. In fact, it means the opposite. It means recognizing the limits of what we currently know. And this is where my position becomes precise. I am not an atheist not because I lean toward belief, but because atheism, in its strictest sense, makes a claim that there is no God. And like any claim about reality, that requires evidence. What I am is agnostic. That means I don't claim certainty either way. I remain open to the possibility that there may be aspects of reality we don't yet understand, perhaps even forms of consciousness or structures beyond current scientific framework. But, and this is crucial, that openness does not extend to accepting specific claims without evidence. The idea of a God who intervenes in human affairs, answers prayers, dictates texts, or suspends natural laws, those are specific claims. And those claims, when tested, are not supported. In many cases, they are directly contradicted by evidence. So the distinction matters. Saying I don't know is not the same as saying I know there is nothing. The first is honest uncertainty. The second is overconfidence in the absence of evidence. And intellectual honesty requires that we stay with that uncertainty without rushing to fill it. Because here's the reality we keep returning to. The universe is already extraordinary. Its scale, its age, its structure, the laws that govern it, and the fact that it produced beings capable of questioning their own existence, these are profound facts. They don't need to be made more impressive by adding explanations we can't test. They are enough, and perhaps more than enough. So as we move forward, the question isn't just whether religion is right or wrong. It's whether we are willing to face reality directly, without filters, without assumptions, and build our understanding from what we can actually observe, test, and learn. Because if we do that, the picture that emerges is not empty. It's deeper, more honest, and far more compelling than most people expect. And in the final part, we're going to bring all of this together, because once you fully follow this path, it changes not just what you believe, but how you see everything. Because when you follow this all the way through, something important changes. It's not just your answers, it's how you approach truth itself. We've tested the strongest religious claims, fine-tuning, creationism, miracles, prayer, and while they raise real questions, they fail as scientific explanations. The evidence simply does not support a God who intervenes in the physical world, suspends natural laws, or directly shapes outcomes in measurable ways. But that doesn't mean we suddenly have all the answers. There's a difference between rejecting unsupported claims and pretending nothing deeper exists. Questions like why the universe exists, what consciousness truly is, or whether reality has layers we haven't discovered yet, these are still open. And this is where honesty matters most. Not certainty, not belief, not denial. Honesty. Science works because it accepts uncertainty. It tests ideas, discards what fails, and keeps moving forward. It doesn't rush to fill gaps, it investigates them. And history shows that those gaps, again and again, have led to deeper understanding, not supernatural explanations. So the most honest position is not I know the answer. It's I'm still looking. That's not weakness, it's the foundation of discovery. Because meaning doesn't require certainty. It comes from engaging with reality as it is, questioning it, exploring it, and understanding our place within it. The universe is already extraordinary. Its scale, its laws, and the fact that we can even ask these questions, that alone is profound. So instead of forcing final answers, the better path is simple. Keep asking, keep testing, stay curious. Because the search itself may be the closest thing we have to truth.